The royal archive at Ugarit on the Syrian coast in the late spring of around 1190 BCE, King Merope at his desk, a scribe at his side pressing wedge marks into wet clay. The letter is a reply to a plea for help from the king of Al-Ashir. On Cyprus, the tablet is now catalogued as RS 18147, published in Ugaritica V. Merope dictates the last lines first. The country, he says, is abandoned to itself. He explains in short factual phrases. His army is in Hatti, sent north to fight for the Hittite king. His fleet is in Lucca, on the southern coast of Anatolia. 7 enemy ships are already in his ports. Cities along his coast are burning. The tablet is unbaked. It is a working document intended for short-term use. The fire that destroys the city within weeks will bake it for him. The letter survived. The city did not. The same pattern brought down 5 great powers in one generation. This is the Late Bronze Age collapse. Between roughly 1207 and 1175 BCE, 5 great powers of the eastern Mediterranean failed. Mycenaean palace civilization, on the Greek mainland and on Crete, the Hittite Empire in central Anatolia, Egypt under the late 19th and early 20th dynasties, the Levantine city-states anchored on Ugarit, the Cypriot polities anchored on Enkomi and Hala Sultan Tekke. Around them in Mesopotamia, Kassite Babylon and Middle Assyria absorbed the same stress on a delayed schedule. The window is roughly a generation. The first Sea People's attack on Egypt is recorded under Merneptah in 1207 BCE. The second wave is defeated under Ramesses III in 1177 BCE. 30 years separate them. Within those 30 years, 4 of the 5 powers were gone. The sources are unusually rich for a prehistoric collapse. The Ugarit cuneiform archives. These include the Royal Palace tablets and the House of Urtenu archive, excavated from 1994. The Medinet Habu inscriptions of Ramesses III at Western Thebes, Papyrus Harris I. The Hittite royal correspondence, the Linear B archive at the Palace of Nestor at Pylos, the Karnak inscription of Merneptah. Behind these, the dendrochronological work of Sturt Manning and the paleoclimate studies of David Kaniewski. The central question is not what happened. The destructions are documented. The question is why all 5 powers failed in the same generation. None of them, individually, faced a single-source crisis it had not faced before. This episode adopts the systemic coupling reading. The reading is Eric Cline's in 1177 C, revised in 2021. It is also A. Bernard Knapp and Sturt Manning's in their 2016 review in the American Journal of Archaeology. The episode rejects single-cause climate explanations. It rejects single-cause invasion explanations. The diagnosis is one sentence. Each polity read its own signal. None read the system. The evidence follows. The Late Bronze Age was a coupled system. Every strength named here is the thing that will fail. Start with bronze. The standard alloy was 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. Bronze armed every soldier and equipped every chariot across the system. The Uluburun shipwreck was found off the southern coast of Turkey. It is dated to around 1320 BCE. The cargo included 10 tons of Cypriot copper and 1 ton of tin. The yield in bronze would have equipped almost 5,000 soldiers. Tin is roughly 30 times rarer in the Earth's crust than copper. No major Mediterranean state had its own tin. Daniel Berger and Ernst Panicka at Heidelberg published the analysis in 2019. The tin found in 13th century Israeli shipwrecks came from Cornwall and Devon in southwest Britain. Alan Williams and Benjamin Roberts confirmed the finding in Antiquity in 2025. Cornwall is roughly 4,000 kilometers from the Levant. Michael Fracchetti, Wayne Powell, and Semel Pullock published in Science Advances in 2022. About a third of the Uluburun tin came from the Mushiston mine in Uzbekistan. Second strength, the Club of Great Powers in Mario Liverani's phrase. The Amarna letters are a cache of 382 cuneiform tablets dated to roughly 1360 to 1330 BCE. They document a standardized diplomacy among Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, Mitanni, and Assyria. Kings addressed each other as my brother. Gifts of gold and lapis lazuli passed in recognized exchange ratios. Eric Cline's social network analysis was published in 2025. It identifies 246 named rulers and 464 documented connections. The system depended on each member's prestige economy. When one member's resources contracted, the form persisted but the function failed. By the late 13th century BCE, surviving correspondence shows requests for grain replacing gifts of gold. Third strength, the Mycenaean palace administration. The Linear B archive at Pylos preserves more than 600 tablets. John Killen's analysis identifies as redistributive economy with detailed inventory, textile workshops, the Tarasijo allotment system for bronze smithing, military rosters listing roughly 800 coast watchers and 600 rowers. The palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, Eclina, and Ios Vasileios were the administrative spine of Greek civilization. The palace was the system. When the palaces burned at the end of the late Helladic 3B period, Greek civilization lost not just its administrative centers, it lost its writing system. Linear B disappears from the archaeological record. Greek would not be written again for roughly 600 years. Fourth strength, the Hittite Empire. 5 centuries of imperial administration from around 1650 to 1190 BCE. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets in 8 scripts. The 1258 BCE Kadesh Treaty with Egypt, preserved in both Egyptian and Hittite versions. Trevor Bryce catalogues the continuity. The heartland was semi-arid. Empire required sustained grain supply. The Hittite state had developed reservoirs and emergency import protocols. Those protocols could handle one bad harvest. They could not handle 3 consecutive bad harvests. These were the strengths. Each one was real. Each one was unprecedented. Together they produced the most integrated economic and diplomatic system the Eastern Mediterranean had ever seen. Each one was also a coupling. The bronze required Cornwall and Uzbekistan. The diplomatic order required prestige goods. The palaces required Mediterranean trade. The Hittite state required Egyptian grain. The coupling enabled the system. The coupling would destroy it. The signals were plain in the record. None of the affected polities assembled them. Begin with the trees. 80 kilometers from the Hittite capital, juniper logs in the Midas Mound tumulus at Gordion preserved a year-by-year climate record. 3 consecutive years show severe water stress. Tree ring widths and stable isotope records of carbon and oxygen place those years at 1198, 1197, and 1196 BCE. The work is Sturt Manning's with Cindy Kocik, Britta Lorentzen, and Jed Sparks, published in Nature in February 2023. 23 juniper samples were analyzed. The window of the study runs from roughly 1270 to 1135 BCE. Only one 3-year sequence within it falls in the lowest 6.25% of moisture values. It is those 3 years. The drought is the tipping point candidate in Manning's framing. Hittite buffering capacity, built to handle 1 bad year, was exceeded by 3. Second signal. The Egyptian grain shipments to Hatti. Around 1213 BCE, in the first year of Pharaoh Meneptah's reign, the Karnak inscriptions record an emergency shipment. The phrase is, grain taken in ships to keep alive this land of Hatti. Earlier letters from the Hittite queen Puduhipa to Ramesses II had made similar requests. A great power was requesting emergency grain from another great power. The request was framed as a matter of state survival, that is a system-state change. The Hittite kings had not requested grain at their peak, they had sent gifts. Third signal, the Ugarit famine letters. The House of Urtenu archive was excavated from 1994 onward. It preserves more than 200 tablets from the final decades of the city. One tablet, RS 34152, records a Hittite official's plea. The text reads, "If there is any goodness in your heart, send even the remainders of the grain staples I requested." Another, RS 18038, contains a Hittite king's request phrased as a matter of life and death. Amurapi writes to Pharaoh Seti II about severe hunger in Ugarit itself. Edward Lipinski published 2 further letters in 2018, from Ramesses III to Amurapi. They suggest contact continued for longer than once thought. The textual record of famine is sustained across more than a generation. This is not a bad harvest. It is a chronic structural condition. Fourth signal, the Pylos tablets. The Okar series records roughly 800 coast watchers, the Opayara. The rower tablets AN1, AN610, and AN724 record roughly 600 rowers, the Irita. The tablets are unbaked working clay. They were intended for short-term use. The fire that destroyed the palace baked them by accident. The archive preserves the operational state of the palace in its final months. Shelley Waxman's 1999 reanalysis reads the deployment as consistent with a defensive posture against expected attack from the sea. The administrative response was bureaucratic registration. The structural response, fortification or evacuation, does not appear in the record and did not occur. Pylos had no walls. The scribe was responding to a known threat. The palace was not. Fifth signal. The Sea Peoples, in two distinct waves separated by 30 years. The first wave reached Egypt under Meneptah at the Battle of Perea in 1207 BCE. The great Karnak inscription names them Ekwesh, Teresh, Lucca, Shurdan, Shekelesh, allied with Libyans under King Merii. The second wave reached Egypt under Ramesses III in year 8 of his reign, around 1177 BCE. The Medinet Habu inscription names them Pelasicheke, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh, lands united. Asaf Yasur Landau's 2010 study examined the reliefs at Medinet Habu. They depict women and children in ox carts travelling with the warriors. This was a migration, not only a raid. Sixth signal. Tin. With palace administrations collapsing, the multi-source supply chain could not be maintained. Cornwall, Uzbekistan, and Anatolia. All three routes broke within a generation. The Bronze Age did not gradually transition to the Iron Age. The bronze supply chain broke. Iron, locally available across the eastern Mediterranean, filled the gap. The signals were forensic. They were also legible to contemporaries in their own interpretive frameworks. The signals reached contemporaries. Sophisticated frameworks failed to read them. Start with the Hittites. Their interpretive tradition was the most developed of the four powers. Around 1300 BCE, when plague spread across the kingdom over a generation, King Mercy II composed a series of prayers. The tablets are catalogued as CTH 378. Mursili identified the cause, a broken oath a generation earlier. His father had killed a Hittite king in a succession dispute. The crisis was divine displeasure. The remedy was ritual confession and renewal. The framework persisted through the 13th century BCE in attenuated form. Tutalia IV consulted oracles. Suppiluliuma II, the last attested Hittite king, consulted oracles. The framework treated every crisis as locally diagnosable and locally correctable. A 3-year drought across a coupled state system is neither. Mursili's framework was sophisticated for plague. It had no language for systemic ecological pressure. Oracles diagnosed ritual error. They could be applied to each failing year. They could not see the pattern of years failing in sequence. The category did not exist in the framework. The trees at Gordian recorded the pattern. The state did not. Second framework, the Ugaritic diplomatic protocol. RS 18147 and the related correspondence preserve Amurapi's reading of the threat. He addresses the king of Elashia as my father. He uses formulae 2 centuries old. The protocol assumed mutual aid through vassal overlord obligations and inter-king brotherhood. It had worked for 2 centuries. It was the protocol the late Bronze Age had been built on. By 1190 BCE, the protocol had become a ritual without a function. The father, Alashia, was himself begging for help. The great king, Hatti, was abandoning his capital. The army Amurapi had sent north would not return. The fleet he had sent west would not return. The form persisted into the moment of destruction. The function was already gone. The protocol assumed a network. The network was dissolving in all directions at once. Amurapi was correctly applying a framework whose assumed conditions had failed. The letter to Alashia is not a misdiagnosis. It is a correct diagnosis within a frame that had become wrong. Third framework, the Egyptian cosmological dualism. The year 8 great inscription at Medinet Habu is dated to around 1177 BCE. It is forensically accurate about who arrived at the Egyptian frontier. The named groups are listed: Pelaset, Cheka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. The reliefs depict the warriors in detail. They also depict the women and children in ox carts behind them. The framework that read this evidence was older than the evidence. The pharaoh embodied Ma'at, the cosmic order. The threat was Isfet, chaos. The Sea Peoples were rendered as a coalition of northerners conspiring in their isles against the divine order. The defeat was the restoration of Mat. The victory could be celebrated as cosmic. The framing made the threat legible as a one-time defeat. It could not see the migration. Within a generation, the Pelaset, defeated at the delta, were settled along the Egyptian-controlled Levantine coast. They are the population that would give Palestine its name. Ramesses III had defeated the Sea Peoples. He had not stopped them. 3 frameworks, all sophisticated, none reading the system. A fourth power, Mycenaean Greece, left no preserved literature on collapse at all. The Pylos archive registered the threat as inventory. Bureaucratic precision met structural inaction. The Omen record gap is itself the finding. The frameworks were wrong because the diagnosis they offered was wrong. The mechanism was structural. None of the contemporary frameworks could see it. By around 1300 BCE, the Late Bronze Age had achieved an interstate coupling without precedent. Trade, tribute, prestige goods, military technology, every system depended on every other. Bronze required Cornwall and Uzbekistan. Diplomacy required prestige goods that required bronze. Palaces required Mediterranean trade that required diplomacy. The Hittite state required Egyptian grain that required Mediterranean trade. The coupling was not an accident of the period. It was the period's achievement. Onto this baseline, stress accumulated through the 13th century BCE. Polymer records from Hala Sultan Teke on Cyprus and Tel Twini in Syria document a long drying envelope. It begins around 1250 BCE and runs for 200 to 300 years. The work is David Kanievsky's and his colleagues. Cave isotope records from Sofula in Turkey by Göktürk and colleagues in 2011 and from Lake Van confirm it. The drying was not sudden, it was a baseline shift. Onto the baseline, the acute shock arrived. Manning's 3-year sequence at Anatolia 1198 to 1196 BCE was the tipping point in the Hittite heartland. Bernard Knapp and Sturt Manning reviewed the evidence in 2016 in the American Journal of Archaeology. They caution against single-cause climate framings. This episode adopts the caution. Climate was the trigger. It was not the mechanism. The mechanism was the absence of redundancy. Mycenaean grain reserves were palace-controlled. The Hittite Empire's emergency grain came from Egypt by a single supply line, relayed through Ugarit. The bronze supply chain had no Mediterranean redundancy. When one link broke, the system could not route around it. The cascade played out across one generation. Drought in central Anatolia around 1198 BCE produced harvest failure. Hittite emergency grain requests intensified. Egypt continued to ship grain, as Ramesses III's letters to Hammurapi confirm. The relay through Ugarit functioned until it did not. Ugarit was sacked around 1190 BCE. The supply line was severed. In parallel, the Mycenaean palaces had been failing on their own schedule. The destruction layers at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, Lahaina, and Ios Vasileios are approximately synchronous. The window is roughly a generation, ending around 1200 BCE. The causes per site are debated. The pattern of synchrony is not. The Hittite royal administration, unable to feed the capital, evacuated Hattusa around 1190 BCE. Jürgen Seeher's excavations show the city was emptied of valuables and records before being burned. The capital lay unoccupied for roughly 4 centuries. Sea peoples' migration accelerated through this window. Egypt absorbed the largest wave at the Battle of the Delta in 1177 BCE. The state survived in diminished form. Within 30 years, the Late Bronze Age system was gone. Alternative explanations exist. They have to be named and rejected. The first alternative is single-cause climate. Brandon Drake argued in 2012 that the drought was sufficient. The 2013 Kanievsky PLOS1 paper is sometimes read in the same direction. The objection is straightforward. Multi-century droughts had occurred in the same region before, in the early Bronze and Middle Bronze. They had not produced collapse. Climate alone is necessary, not sufficient. The second alternative is single-cause invasion. The older Sea Peoples literature treated them as external invaders who broke the system. The systematic excavations of Pila Kokkinokramos and Tel Twini have made this hard to maintain. The ox cart reliefs at Medinet Habu contradict it. So does the geographic origin of the named groups in regions already inside the system that was collapsing. The Sea Peoples were the system's shedding population. They were not an external cause. Cline's 2014 framing, revised 2021, and Knapp and Manning's 2016 review converge on the systemic coupling reading. This episode adopts it. The mechanism was structural. The endgame was overdetermined. By around 1200 BCE, the mechanism was no longer reversible. What follows is the chronology, compressed. 1207 BCE, the Battle of Perire. Pharaoh Meneptah defeats the first Sea Peoples coalition, Ekwesh, Teresh, Lucca, Sherdan, Shekelesh, with Libyan allies under King Merie. The Great Karnak inscription, the Athribis stele, and the Israel stele record the victory in 3 separate inscriptions. The wave does not stop coming. A second wave will arrive 30 years later, around 1200 BCE. The Mycenaean palaces. Destruction layers appear at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, Ecliana, and Ios Vasileios. All approximately synchronous, within a window of roughly a generation. End of the late Helladic 3B period. Linear B disappears from the archaeological record. The redistributive economy disappears with it. Greek will not be written again for roughly 600 years. The cause per site is debated. Internal political failure at some, regional warfare at others, raids at the coast. The pattern of synchrony is the central fact. The 2024 volume on Synchronizing the Destructions, published by the Aegeus Society, reviews the evidence. 1198 to 1196 BCE. The Anatolian drought, in Manning's reading. 3 consecutive years in the lowest 6.25% of moisture values in the 135-year window before and after. The Hittite buffering capacity is exceeded. Hattusa cannot feed itself. The state begins to plan its withdrawal. Around 1192 to 1190 BCE, Ugarit, the city is sacked. The Hammurapi correspondence ends mid-archive. Tablets baked by the destruction fire preserve the final letters. The merchant oligarchy of the bronze trade in Carol Bell's analysis disappears as a class. The Phoenician cities further south, Tyre and Sidon and Byblos, survive in altered form. The Tel Twini destruction, 15 kilometers south of Ugarit, is radiocarbon dated by David Kanievsky and colleagues to the same window. Ugarit's destruction is total. Around 1190 BCE, Hattusa, the royal administration evacuates the capital. Valuables are removed, official records are removed. The city is later burned. The royal archive ends mid-sentence. The last attested Hittite king is Suppiluliuma II. The capital will lie empty for roughly 4 centuries. Jürgen Seeher's excavations for the German Archaeological Institute are the basis for this reading. The older Sea People's Sack reading is no longer maintainable. Where the royal administration relocated, if it relocated, the record does not say. 1177 BCE, year 8 of Ramesses III. The Battle of the Delta. Egypt defeats the Second Sea Peoples Coalition by sea and by land. The reliefs at Medinet Habu commemorate the victory at scale. Egypt has won the battle. Egypt has lost the system. The Levantine Empire ends. The Pelsets settle along the coast Egypt no longer controls. The settlement, 2 generations later, will be the population that gives the region the name Palestine. 1155 BCE. The pharaoh's own household. Ramesses III is assassinated in what is now called the Harem conspiracy. The judicial papyrus of Turin records the trial of 39 conspirators. Modern CT scanning of his mummy in 2012 confirmed a fatal throat wound. The pharaoh who defeated the Sea Peoples could not survive his own queens. Egypt continues, diminished through the rest of the 20th dynasty. 5 empires, 1 generation. The diagnosis, 1 sentence. The Late Bronze Age was a tightly coupled system. Tight coupling amplified localized stress instead of absorbing it, and each polity's collapse accelerated its neighbors. The signals were forensic, drought records in the trees of Anatolia and the sediments of the Levant. Grain emergency shipments treated as state survival matters. Refugee migrations recorded in Egyptian relief and Egyptian inscription. Tin supply disruption traceable from Cornwall to the Levant. The frameworks were cognitive. Ritual error in Hittite. Diplomatic protocol in Ugarit, cosmological dualism in Egypt, bureaucratic inventory in Pylos. Each polity read its own signal, none read the system. This is the cross-civilization pattern. It is what happens when state systems grow interdependent without growing redundancy. 2 cases recur to the same pattern. The Maya classic collapse in the Yucatan and the Piton, between roughly 750 and 900 CE. A multi-decade drought recorded in cenote sediment cores saw intersected with elite warfare among coupled city-states. Tikal, Calakmul, Karakol, each city's response was to intensify conflict with its rivals. The same coupling failure at smaller scale over a longer tempo. The late antique Mediterranean, between roughly 535 and 750 CE. The Justinianic plague, the late antique Little Ice Age, sustained Sasanian and Roman warfare and the Arab expansion. The mechanism is the same, a coupled order amplifying rather than absorbing shock. A different system. Back to the palace at Ugarit around 1190 BCE, Hammurapi at his desk, the scribe pressing the last lines into wet clay. The country is abandoned to itself. Hammurapi was right, the country was abandoned. So was every other country. The system was the country.